Hi, welcome everyone. I think we're going to get going here. Welcome to our Forest Service Grants and Agreements 101 webinar. My name is Emery Cowan, pronoun she, her, and I work with the Watershed Research and Training Center and the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. Our organizations are excited to be hosting this webinar along with coalitions and collaboratives, as well as with participation from several members of the Forest Service Grants and Agreements team. So I wanted to kick it off with some Zoom reminders today. Uh, we are going to have the chat box turned off for attendees, but we will be sharing a lot of different resources throughout the course of the webinar in the chat box, so keep an eye on that. And you're welcome to use the Q&A box, though, at any time during the presentation to enter a question that we'll bring forward into our Q&A time near the end of the webinar. We do have interpretation, ASL and Spanish language interpretation available today. So to access that, you can just click on the little interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom bar. And that's also where you'll find closed captioning. Lastly, we are recording this webinar and we will be sending out a recording of that and the slides and all resources shared to everyone who registers today. We will also be posting those recordings on our website, which I'll be sharing in the next slide. Alrighty, so this series is the second in a three-parter with the overall goal of providing a basic understanding of the Forest Service as an agency and the financial tools it uses to deliver funding to and work in partnership with communities. Our first session, which was last week, introduced the agency, its scope, structure, and avenues for partnership. And then the second and third webinars are more focused on the grants and agreements tools themselves and their key functions, how they relate to each other, as well as insights from longtime grants and agreements practitioners about how these tools get put into practice. So my colleague Eric is sharing our website where you can view the recording of the first session or sign up for the third session, which is scheduled for next week. Okay. So as I mentioned, we are excited to be hosting this webinar alongside coalitions and collaboratives. And our ability to host this training is supported and enabled by our involvement and partnership in the Forest Services Community Navigator Initiative. That's a relatively new effort that was kicked off last year to support leaders in historically underserved communities and better identifying and accessing Forest Service funding and partnership opportunities with a goal of promoting more equitable distribution of a lot of the big funding investments that have come through the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and other pieces of legislation. So there are 6 organizations involved in the Community Navigators Initiative. Those are all listed on the side of this slide. And we each have a somewhat unique skill sets, networks, focal areas. So that has really allowed us to together offer a nice diversity of and pretty comprehensive scope of capacity building and assistance services to communities. So kind of however you access us, we are doing a lot of coordination on the back end to make sure communities find the right source of support. The Forest Service has also brought on a couple of internal community navigators to also support this effort. So we're all kind of working as a team to get communities the best resources, navigation services that we can. So again, all those links to all of our community navigation partners are being shared in the chat box. In terms of the type of work that we do, it falls into a couple major buckets. One is one-on-one support, where we're helping communities evaluate, explore different funding opportunities. We do some proposal support and kind of review, and then we also help with post-award assistance and project implementation. We also do program develop. Sorry, dealing with persistent cat. We also do program development support where we're connecting folks with subject matter experts, peer support around starting or growing their work in community and climate resilience work. And then we also do trainings like these and capacity building that really helps to hopefully help people better understand how to navigate these different federal systems. So we do offer a monthly newsletter and a list of, we are always kind of compiling different funding resources and opportunities. And so those are all available via our website that Eric is sharing in the chat box. Alrighty, moving right along. So turning back to the plan for today, myself and a couple of other community navigator partners are going to tag team a primer presentation about grants and agreements with a real focus on the tools that are especially relevant to community scale partners working on climate and wildfire resilience. During when kind of reviewing our the questions that people put forward when registering for this webinar, we heard a lot of questions around like, what are all the different agreements? What are they used for? What type of projects or work can I really move forward through these tools? So that's what this part of the presentation is intended to address and start kind of mapping out that array of different tools and pathways for folks. After that, we'll hear from the team at the Forest Service's Grants and Agreements Outreach and Partnership Engagement Branch, introducing some of their work and their relatively new office that's doing a lot around increasing grants and agreements accessibility. So really in line with the intent of these webinars, and we're just grateful to have them on. In addition to presenting, some of their team are going to be joining us for question and answer. So there'll be great resources for any kind of deeper dive questions that you all have after this presentation. Alrighty, so for our presenters today, we'll have myself, Emily Troisi with the Watershed Research and Training Center and FACNet, and Michelle Bloodsworth with Coalitions and Collaboratives. All of us are part of our community navigator teams at our respective organizations. We'll also have Monica Irvin and Robin Taylor Davenport. They're both part of the Grants and Agreements Outreach and Partnership Engagement Branch. Oh, and we will also be joined by Darby Seward and Trinity Bugger, who are both with the Grants and Agreements Policy Branch and specializing in a lot of these different agreements that we're going to be talking about. So lots of expertise here in the room today. Before we dive in, I do want to make a quick disclaimer from the COCO and Watershed Center FACNet side of things. We as organizations have been very involved. We've been partners on a lot of these grants and agreements tools, and we have been involved with communities and supporting communities and using these tools as well. But we do want to underscore that we're not part of the Forest Service and we're not speaking for the Forest Service as part of this webinar today or our involvement in the Community Navigator Initiative. We're really just see a need and a huge value in sharing this information to help communities navigate these pretty complex federal systems and processes. So that's why we're here. We really see a lot of value in helping demystify these, again, tools and systems because we've seen them really enable some impactful and meaningful work on the ground. So this presentation is based on Forest Service training materials that Robin and Monica helped us compile, and then we've done some synthesis and kind of tweaking to help kind of tailor this to what we've identified our needs from communities that we've been working with. And just want to note that we know this presentation and all presentations can only cover so much. So do want to just encourage folks to connect with any of us if you have follow-up questions or needs. Okay. Great. Well, I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Michelle, to kick us off.
Thank you, Emery. I hope my sound is good. Are you hearing me?
We're great. Yeah.
Great. So hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Bloodsworth, and I am the Grants and Account Director for Coalitions and Collaboratives, also known as COCO to many of you. And in my role with COCO, I'm very fortunate to work with communities from all over the nation who found a great benefit in utilizing some of the federal funding tools that we will cover today. And best of all, I am passionate about providing assistance to new entities and organizations looking to access federal funding opportunities. So please take notes. Be ready to ask questions during our Q&A session at the end. Forest Service staff and Community Navigators team, we're eager to help. So in the introduction section, we're going to cover the Forest Service implementation tools, the universe of the Forest Service grants and agreements, and Forest Service fiscal year 2024 obligations. Next slide, please. So starting broadly, the Forest Service has a few general categories of tools that it can use to work with other entities to fulfill its mission and accomplish work on the ground through contracts, grants or cooperative agreements, and other partnership agreements. So each of these tools have distinct characteristics around who benefits, the level of Forest Service involvement, and the financial relationship between parties. For this presentation in particular, we're going to be focusing on the latter two categories as key tools the Forest Service uses to develop partnership and deliver funding to communities. This is also the arena where the Community Navigators Initiative is focusing our work to support specific bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act grants and agreements. Next slide, please. So now we're digging a bit deeper, and this is the universe, as we're going to refer to it today, of the Forest Service's grants and agreement tools. Don't worry about trying to absorb all of these. We just want to point out that the Forest Service has a lot of tools at its disposal to work with non-Forest Service entities in different ways. The three categories of grants and agreements tools that we'll be focusing on today are highlighted to the right, and they are federal financial assistance, restoration agreements, and partnership agreements. These are our focus because they're the most utilized for restoration, wildfire resilience, climate adaptation activities, and we've heard are most relevant to our community navigators, the Fire Adapted Communities Network and COCO networks, and are a place where we as community navigators can provide direct support and connections. So Eric's going to drop a link in the chat about another resource that delves into this expansive universe of grants and agreements in a bit more detail. And I highly encourage that you take a look at this particular resource. I've personally found it very helpful in identifying when and where these different agreements are best utilized. Next slide, please. So here's the Forest Service fiscal year 2024 obligations on this chart here. We thought the chart would be a great illustration of how dollars flow through the various types of Forest Service grants and agreements. You can see that a majority of funding does go to grants, but cooperative agreements and other agreements combined together still receive the majority of funding. And we as community navigators are here to bridge the gap for communities who have historically been unable to access these funds. Because use of these tools has really ramped up since the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and other laws, we really feel this is a timely learning topic for anyone that's seeking these opportunities. Next slide, please. So for the next section, we'll take a deeper dive into the key grants and agreements tools that are supported through the Community Navigators Initiative. We are going to discuss federal financial assistance and non-federal financial assistance. Next slide, please. So the first category of grants and agreements tools is federal financial assistance, which is used to transfer money, property, services, or anything of value to accomplish a public purpose or benefit. And it's important to see that that's the key defining feature of federal financial assistance. It's also important to note that several of the key bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act funding opportunities where community navigators provide support use these specific grants and cooperative agreements to deliver funding. And we will discuss some specific examples a bit later. So federal financial assistance is used broadly across the Forest Service and is delivered through these two tools or instruments through grants and cooperative agreements. So you can think of grants and cooperative agreements as being solar systems in the federal financial assistance galaxy. Next slide, please. So key aspects of federal financial assistance, a few common features are that one, it's largely accessed through grants.gov. And you're welcome to use this QR code that's on the screen and can scan with your phone, and that will take you to the search page for grants.gov where you can find the Forest Service grants that are available. There, another unique feature is, or common feature, they are used in arrangements where the benefit will be to the larger public rather than the Forest Service. So often used for activities that are off of the National Forest System lands. Another common feature is that they do follow uniform guidance and forms. So for example, it follows what's referred to as the 2 CFR 200, which is a federal government-wide uniform financial guidance and regulation, and incorporates the use of standard forms. So recipients can expect to see the same forms if they're receiving funding via grants or cooperative agreements. These forms can be taxing for new entities and organizations. So if you find yourself feeling stuck on a 424, a 425, or a 270 form, don't hesitate to reach out for help. And that's where we as community navigators work to provide support. Next slide, please. So we've talked about some similarities between grants and cooperative agreements. Now we're going to talk about some key distinctions between grants and cooperative agreements. And we're going to drop a link in the chat that will, for reference, that will better explain the difference between grants, agreements, and contracts. For grants and cooperative agreements, the basic distinction is the amount of Forest Service involvement. Partners should expect more Forest Service involvement in cooperative agreements versus more hands-off for grants. And some insights that we found as community navigators, something that would be helpful for you all is, especially with a cooperative agreement where substantial involvement is anticipated, it's good to set clear expectations about what substantial involvement means and whether it aligns with expectations of both parties during the initial development of the agreement. So on the lower portion of this slide is a list of the key bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act funding opportunities where community navigators can provide support. And you will notice that these opportunities are a mix of grants and cooperative agreements. So next slide, please. So now we're going to transition to another galaxy of Forest Service agreements, and that is the non-federal financial assistance agreements, partnership agreements, and restoration agreements. We'll talk about partnership agreements a little bit in detail right now, and then later on, Emily is going to talk about restoration agreements. Next slide, please. Key aspects of agreements. So let's discuss some key aspects that apply specifically to non-federal financial assistance agreements and how it differentiates from the federal financial assistance. First, they're non-competitive, meaning they aren't widely advertised, predetermined funding opportunities that you'll find on grants.gov. Instead, these agreements come about from connections and relationships between partners and Forest Service staff, such as program managers or partnership coordinators. Our next webinar session will dive deeper into how these agreement projects come about, so don't forget to register. Timelines. Development of agreements isn't constrained to a certain timeline or a specific timeline, though most of the time funding does need to be committed to agreements by the end of the Forest Service's fiscal year in September, so there tends to be a big rush in late summer to get agreements finalized. Also, length of agreements can vary as well, and different instruments have different maximum terms. On the scale and scope of work encompassed in agreements, this can also be quite variable. Agreements can be developed at the forest, the regional or national scale, and tailored based on partner and Forest Service goals and funding opportunities. There are a few different possible structures for agreements that follow or that allow for modification as a project evolves or conditions change. And for funding sources, agreements can be funded through various funding sources within the Forest Service. So as you'll see, there's a common trend of variability. Use and interpretation of these agreements also varies across different Forest Service deputy areas, regions, and people. So one example of what that means is a certain project that was made possible through a certain agreement tool and approach in one place might be more challenging or approached differently in another place. Upsides about these aspects of non-federal financial assistance agreements is that there is room for creativity, innovation, and projects that are better tailored to partners and context. The downsides are that because relationship building is essential for acquiring and being successful with these types of agreements, these tools are inherently limited to organizations with the time, capability, and connections to build relationships with the Forest Service, presenting issues of equity and accessibility. Agreements can also be difficult to understand, confusing in part due to variability and use across people and places. So because these agreements are so variable and depend on relationship building, that's why we as community navigators and the outreach and partnership engagement branch of the Forest Service work so hard to bridge the gap for communities to access and successfully utilize these tools. Next slide, please. So diving deeper into this part of the grants and agreements universe, partnership agreements are one category of the non-federal financial assistance agreements. Key features are that they mutually benefit, mutual interest, and there's a greater U.S. Forest Service involvement. Two specific agreement types fall into this category. One is the challenge cost share agreements, and two are the participating agreements. Next slide, please. So many of these slides have been a bit text heavy, and so please bear with us. The good news is these slides will be available for you to review at a later time and to reference. So challenge cost share agreements are utilized in many areas of the Forest Service and are used to develop, plan, and implement mutually beneficial projects that enhance Forest Service activities. Challenge cost share agreements can be used for a broad range of different activities and with many possible cooperators. So they're a pretty common go-to tool for the Forest Service, and they refer to the challenge cost share agreements as the Swiss Army knife of agreement tools. It's important to note that these agreements only allow for reimbursable payments and no advances, and therefore it makes it a little more challenging for smaller or new organizations. An example we want to share of a challenge cost share is COCO has a challenge cost share with the Pike San Isabel National Forest to support the Southern Colorado Collaborative. It's where numerous partners are being brought together for a specific project focus. And what we want to demonstrate is that we as community navigators do have experience with these different types of agreements and are eager to help other new entities and organizations acquire and successfully utilize them. So next slide, participating agreements. So these have a somewhat narrower scope than the challenge cost share and are focused on four specific areas. One, cooperative pollution abatement. Two, job training and development. Three, development of environmental education and forest history materials. And four, forestry protection. Some key features include that this means could be a number of possible cooperators. And geographically, while they are primarily for work on national forest system land, one key feature is that the Forest Service has a specific authority called the Widen Authority that allows for participating agreements to be used to support work that is off of national forest system lands when there is a benefit to a national forest system watershed or resources. So the Widen Authority is a really valuable authority for all lands and cross-boundary work, and we'll be referencing it later on in the presentation, but for now, we're going to put a fuller explanation of the authority in the chat for you to refer to on your time. So another feature I just want to cover quickly on participating agreements is that it does include reimbursable or advance payments, and the reason this is important is for newer or small organizations that may have a hard time fronting cash for their project work and the wait to be reimbursed by the Forest Service. An example I do want to share is the Watershed Center has a number of participating agreements with local national forests, and one of those agreements supports a local youth crew. Another supports establishment of a seed bank for reseeding and restoration projects and conducting community education and outreach about noxious weeds. So there again, just highlighting our experience with these agreements. And now I want to turn it over to Emily on the next slide to talk with you more about restoration agreements. Thank you, Emily.
Wonderful. Thanks, Michelle. My name is Emily, and I work for the Fire Adapted Communities Network. I'm going to share a little bit about the next category of agreements that we'll focus on for today, which are restoration agreements. These are a trio of agreements intended for activities that restore, enhance, and maintain ecosystems and watersheds. Next slide. The first we'll talk about is stewardship agreements. These are intended to accomplish specific restoration-focused objectives, including forest, soil, and watershed health, with a key emphasis on addressing local and rural community needs. There are a few key aspects of stewardship agreements that support this purpose. First, there is a collaboration requirement. So Forest Service policy requires that staff make an effort to involve a variety of local interests and engage key stakeholders in collaboration throughout the life of the stewardship projects. Exchange of goods for services means that revenues from forest products such as timber harvested on a stewardship agreement project can be used to pay for restoration services in the same project, which better accommodates projects that include a mix of commercial and non-commercial service work, such as forest thinning with wildfire mitigation and watershed restoration objectives. Retained receipts means that these agreements allow for excess revenues from timber or other forest products on a project to be retained and reinvested in other stewardship projects in the same area, rather than proceeds being sent to the US Treasury, as normally happens with revenue generated from Forest Service land management activities. And importantly, for folks in this webinar who might be involved with collaborative groups, these stewardship retained receipts can be used for not only on the ground implementation, but also to pay for things like facilitation and meeting space that supports collaborative processes related to stewardship projects. Agreement terms on these agreements can be for up to 10 or even 20 years in some cases. The broad partners feature allows for a range of potential partners, including private businesses, such as utilities in certain cases. And lastly, with widen authority use, we discussed widen authority a little bit earlier in relation to participating agreements. Well, stewardship agreements can also incorporate the widen authority to allow for stewardship projects that include work both on and off National Forest System lands, as long as there's an overall benefit to National Forest System lands. We wanted to bring that up again, knowing that cross-boundary work was a particular interest that we heard among several webinar registrants today. And incorporating the widened authority into stewardship agreements unlocks that cross-boundary capability. One example of use of this agreement is a long-term stewardship agreement that's used to enable the Ashland Forest Resiliency Stewardship Project, a collaborative forestry project that aims to reduce the risk of severe wildfire in the watershed for the city of Ashland, located in Southern Oregon. And Eric's going to drop in the chat for us a resource from the National Forest Foundation that provides a more thorough overview of stewardship agreements. Next slide. Good neighbor agreements have similar restoration-focused objectives as stewardship agreements, but they are used exclusively for partnerships between the Forest Service and states, counties, and tribes. Potential activities could include activities to treat insect and disease-infected trees, activities to reduce hazardous fuels, surveys to support the National Environmental Protection Act, and any other activities to restore or improve forest, rangeland, and watershed health, including fish and wildlife habitat. Some key features of these agreements include the ability to include both commercial work, like restoration-focused timber sales, and non-commercial restoration projects like culvert replacement or hazardous fuels mitigation. The allowance for states, but not counties or tribes, to retain revenues generated on good neighbor projects and to use those funds to accomplish additional restoration activities under a good neighbor agreement in that same state. So, similar to stewardship agreements, this feature allows for more local or regional decision making about how project revenues get spent. Also, similar to stewardship agreements, good neighbor agreements can be used with the Wyden Authority to allow for projects that span both national forest system and non-national forest system lands. One example of implementation of the Good Neighbor Agreement is between the Payette National Forest in Idaho and Valley County that cites the Wyden Authority. Through this agreement, the Forest Service is providing funding to the county to hire a wildfire mitigation specialist and contract with crews to conduct hazardous fuels reduction on federal and non-federal lands in the county's wildland-urban interface. And you can learn more about the Good Neighbor Authority use across the West from this great resource that Eric will drop in the chat from the Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition. Next slide. 638 agreements allow the Forest Service to work in partnership with tribes to improve forest health and restoration on national forest system lands that border or are adjacent to tribal trust lands or trust resources. These agreements can only be used to implement activities connected to projects proposed and approved under the Tribal Forest Protection Act. The use of these authorities and agreement mechanisms is still pretty new, and so we wanted to point you towards one of our partners, the First Nations Development Institute, who is an expert in tribal agreements with the Forest Service and one of our Community Navigators implementation partners. They are a great resource for more information on this topic, and so we'll drop their information and a few of their webinar links related to this topic in the chat for a more detailed explanation and a deeper dive into 638 agreements and the Tribal Forest Protection Act. Next slide. So lastly, we've been talking a lot about sort of the different agreement types, and folks participating may have picked up that there is some overlap in what activities they could enable, and you're not wrong in feeling that way. So one topic of interest among a lot of our registrants today was around cooperative prescribed burning. And for that activity alone, there are at least 8 different agreement types that might be used based on partner type, project purpose, land ownership, and other factors. So needless to say, there is a lot to sort through just to figure out what legal instrument could be used for a particular activity or partnership. So now I'm going to hand it over to Emery to talk briefly about that decision-making process. And I want to just quickly note again that we do have G&A policy experts here in the Zoom room with us to dig into some of those nuances of these tools and the decision-making about them. So Emery, I'll turn it back to you to talk about authorities, instruments, and funding.
Great, thanks, Emily. Shoot, I apologize, y'all. The slide seems to have gone a little wonky, so we are skip right through it. So I'm going to round us out with a short discussion about grants and agreements decision making, and again, that's a place where we have our great grants and agreement staff to delve deeper. But an important aspect when folks are working outside of an established grant program like Wood Innovations or community wildfire defense grants are this process of piecing together authorities, kind of 3 interconnected elements, one being the authority or the law that actually allows the Forest Service to commit funding or resources to whatever is envisioned by a project. And the Forest Service has more than 50 authorities that it can be working with for that realm. The other element is instrument, and that's what we've been talking about a lot today. Instruments are things like participating agreements, cooperative agreements that really formalize the funding relationship between the Forest Service and a partner. And then the third is funding source. So really important to have the dollars that are actually classified as being able to be spent on whatever is envisioned by the project. And so just going back to one of the watershed center examples that Michelle mentioned, one agreement that around the native biodiversity protection cites 3 different authorities to really encapsulate the full scope of work that project envisions. It uses a participating agreement. And then in terms of funding, I wasn't able to discern exactly what funding streams were being used to support that, but an example could include invasive species related appropriated dollars or things like Title II funding that comes through Secure Rural Schools, if folks are familiar with that. So that's just kind of a little bit of an overview of what elements need to be kind of pieced together and aligned to support a project. And I think the key takeaway that we wanted to underscore is just that these elements require input from definitely Forest Service grants, management specialists, program managers, potentially Forest Service partnership coordinators, but also it's really important for partners to be involved in those discussions to make sure that each of these pieces are truly going to be supporting what's being envisioned by that project. And so that everyone is on the same page about what is and isn't possible based on the various sideboards and allowances associated with each of these elements. This may be a familiar tool to some and not to others, but the Forest Service has developed a number of different tools to aid staff in getting started on finding the right grant or agreement tool to support a project. This agreements decision tree is one of a few that are pretty frequently utilized. So this will often be used to kind of get things started, and then a grants management specialist will dig deeper into the Forest Service policy, handbook, and manual to make sure that that really is the right path forward. Um, some of this can definitely get into the weeds, and partners certainly aren't expected to know a lot of these different nuances, but the key is really making sure that there's a clear vision of what all the program or project really seeks to undertake, because everything else tiers from that. So with that, I will turn it over to our great grants and agreement staff. We have Monica up first, who are going to be presenting some of their information, and again, they'll be joining us in the Q&A session. So Monica, over to you.
Thank you, Marie. So I'm Monica Irvin. Again, I'm with the Forest Service Office of Grants and Agreements, Outreach and Partnership Engagement Branch. And I'm going to talk a little bit about negotiating match and the waiver and reduction guidance. So as we've been through this presentation today, talking a lot about the different components of our grants and agreements, and a key element is this concept of match. And so another reason I'm presenting it is because as we were developing this webinar, it kind of felt like, you know, maybe a grants management specialist should present on highlighting some of the different policy changes. And then it also aligns with what our branch in the Office of Partnership or Outreach and Partnership Engagement Branch are offering, and what Robin will be speaking about in just a few minutes. So next slide, please. Just a quick overview. We'll get down to the basics. So what negotiating match, this is also known as cost share. So we're going to look at the most important piece is to understand that when, from a Forest Service perspective, when we're calculating match, it is calculated as a percentage of the total project cost. So match historically was a policy kind of blanket of a minimum of 20%. And if we wanted to assess anything less than that, then it required an extensive deviation process. And so we still have a policy and look at, you know, negotiating that 20%. But what I'll get into in the next slide is some of our options for perhaps a waiver or reduction. But then also match is also determined by the authority. So as Emery was sharing, there's different components, and we really build to make up all of our different agreements. And so this is one that can be or not a barrier for our partners. So what can be match, right? You have to, there's this 20% to an amount. How do I even come up with that? Well, we really look at it in kind of two different components. One is going to be the non-cash. And so that'll be a direct expense to you as a partner. So it's a salary that you may be paying. So maybe there's a few hours that we can match to the salary that is being offered or paid for through the project, as well as different travel, supplies or materials. And there's also some different ways to think about just what is the overall cost to this project, and where are we maybe not capturing some of those that we can be looking at as match. And that kind of goes into that more in kind. So this is going to be something that is of value that you're contributing to the project, but not a direct expense. So if somebody's volunteering their time, you can calculate the value of that time, as well as maybe somebody donated who was not another non-federal partner, that you can use that, or supplies left over from another project that you can now contribute to this project. You can calculate that as in kind. One really key thing, though, to be aware of when negotiating the match is that often, unless it's specifically authorized by law, it cannot be other federal funds. So if you're working for an organization that works with different federal agencies, it is important to be clear about where the match funding is coming from. Next slide, please. So here we're actually getting to break through some barriers. In 2022, Forest Service Chief Randy Moore issued a policy change that now allows for a match waiver or reduction, and without necessarily having to go through this huge deviation process, and just allows for more of that negotiation to help make our agreements a little bit more approachable for different partners. And so that does kind of go back into, again, the importance of understanding how authorities play into our agreements here at the Forest Service. So the authority, like we mentioned before, we have the participating agreement, and that cites our Cooperative Funds and Deposits Act. And that act doesn't actually state that we have to have a certain number of a matching percentage, or even that we need to require a match at all. So with this new policy change, through the letter that Chief Moore has issued, and I think we have the full guidance that'll be dropped in the chat here as well. Thank you. And so now we can have a little more flexibility. So there's an offer for a full waiver if you're a tribal organization or doing a partner in projects located in underserved communities. So real quick, tribal organizations sometimes might not be fully understood what we mean from the Forest Service perspective. So it's going to be, any federally recognized tribe. And then here at the Forest Service, we also have our Office of Tribal Relations. And so they're managing another list of tribal organizations that, once approved, we can do these full waivers for. So if you feel like you fall into that, contact our Office of Tribal Relations and they can help. And then for other partners and projects that are outside of our tribal or underserved communities, we can also negotiate as far as a 5% reduction that is on an agreement by agreement basis. So the authority may allow for a waiver or reduction depending on if it states that a cost share is mandatory. And then depending on the type of entity you have, may allow either a full waiver or reduction as well. And then in the next slide, we'll take a look at exactly kind of how that looks for you. So this is really negotiated, again, on an agreement by agreement basis. So there's not really an ability to just like request it and then all of a sudden you are pre-approved for a 2% match in all agreements. It's going to be, and it's going to be negotiated at the local level. So you really want to work with your local grants management specialists, program managers, partnership coordinators, and all parties involved to ensure that it'll be a justification forum, ask a few questions, and then we'll work through that approval process. And then again, the tribal waivers have a little bit different of a process, and they don't require the chief's approval. And then another just key different point too is that anything under 5% may take a little bit more time, just as it does take an extra approval process from the chief. So there's some differentiations depending on what percentage of match you're trying to negotiate. But most importantly is that we have a huge flexibility in what we're able to offer in our cost share requirements. So I'm going to now jump to the next slide and pass it on to my colleague Robin in the Office of Grants and Agreements Outreach and Partnership Engagement Branch. And she's going to share exactly kind of where we fit in a little bit of this grants and agreements universe.
Hey, Monica, before we do that transition, we just had one question in the chat that I think really ties nicely into your presentation about what constitutes an underserved community. Could you speak to what tool the Forest Service is using to determine or to define underserved community, or what strategies?
I believe right now we're still using the CGEST tool. So I don't know if we have a resource to offer that would give more explanation about that. If we continue on, we can look for something real quick and put that into the chat. I also know that it is more explained. It is explained a little bit more in depth in our official policy letter as well.
Great, and that's climate and economic justice screening tool for folks.
Thank you. I did not know what it stood for at the moment, so I appreciate the clarification. And that is part of what we present in our justification when offering those matches, those waivers.
Awesome, thanks. And we'll try to find a link and put that in the chat as well. Thanks, Monica.
Yeah, I'll work on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Hello, my name is Robin Taylor Davenport, and I'm with the Office of Grants and Agreements Outreach and Partnership Engagement Branch. Next slide, please. Interested in partnering with or are new to the Forest Service grants and agreements, have a grant or agreement but need help at any phase of the grants and agreements, the Outreach and Partnership Engagement Branch is here to guide you. Through this presentation, you are learning more about how grants and agreements offer valuable opportunities for a diverse range of organizations to engage in proactive partnerships. Working together, these partnerships support the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Forest Service mission to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands for present and future generations. Next slide, please. Last year, we started working on a tool that could do the following: create a new partnership approach to mirror the federal-wide award process, maximize flexibility of Forest Service legislative of non-competitive authority while increasing the pool of partners, support programs to meet increased project scale and funding. So in short, a process to advertise opportunities for partnering with the Forest Service using agreements and not grants. A process working with the program managers to find the needs on the ground to create opportunities for partners using a platform to find those opportunities. The outreach of interest is a non-competitive advertisement tool that is posted on grants.gov. The outreach of interest is a mechanism to cultivate relationships and expand potential partners. The outreach of interest is intended to solicit responses for potential partnerships for mutually beneficial projects. Submissions will be used to identify new partnership opportunities, enhance relationships, facilitate discussions, and refine project ideas between potential partners and the Forest Service. We currently have 12 outreach of interests that are ready to publish and one in draft form. We have been contacted by 2 other regions and a program in the Washington office to start working on 3 more. So you can see that these opportunities are spread throughout several program areas, which can be used across the country in the different regions of the Forest Service and amongst many states. These opportunities will be published on grants.gov soon. Next slide, please. One of our goals in our branch is to increase outreach mechanisms. And some of those mechanisms that we're working on is creating a brochure about our branch, explaining our services, resources, and ways that folks can contact us. Our branch communicates and works with many program areas and organizations. We're working and collaborating together with other program areas to make sure that we are providing the best possible resources for partners to use. Currently, we are working on a roadshow. By having this roadshow, we will be able to collaborate with partnership coordinators, county extension offices, economic development programs, and regions to promote resources, partnership opportunities and customer service. Our branch will be presenting at regional areas and external events to let partners know about the services that we provide and the opportunities that are available. Next slide, please. We've been collaborating with community navigators, partnership coordinators, and other program areas to help connect people to answers, relationships, projects, and opportunities. We offer the technical perspective in resources. To better assist partners with the grants and agreements process, we have been building many resources. We have assisted in creating a pre-award guide focusing on grants and cooperative agreements, which are the federal financial awards. We also created an award administration guide, and we're currently creating a partnership agreements guide that is close to being finished. And this guide is focused on agreements and will help walk partners through the agreement process. In order to assist partners, we want to make sure that we can help in areas that were found to be challenging or have barriers. And we've already started creating some quick guides. These quick guides will act as references and instructions for many of the grants and agreements processes, such as SAM.gov, grants.gov, the SF424 forms, the SF425 forms. We have plans to increase our resources and quick guides into the future as we start to find out from partners and from our other program areas of what those barriers might be and what those resources might be for needs. Next slide, please. A big part of what we do is customer service, and our branch offers 2 separate mechanisms for direct contact to get their questions answered. We can be reached by email using our outreach and partnership engagement inbox to help answer any questions you may have, or we can be contacted directly with questions that come up. And we are, by using our consultation, our one-on-one consultation site, which we'd be able to have intimate discussions on the questions and the concerns and issues that you may have. We're happy to assist you with any questions and resource needs. And you'll see that we'll have the contact information in the chat, and we look forward to talking with you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. Sorry to advance the slide a little bit on you. But this is great. Thank you so much. We're now going to transition to our Q&A. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'd like to invite Robin, Monica, Trinity, and Darby onto the screen. And we have been getting an amazing amount of questions. So thank you all for putting those in, and we welcome more as we start working our way through these. I will direct folks. I think Trinity and a few others have been starting to answer some of these questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to bring a few of them forward into the webinar just to make sure that we get them in the recording and that everyone has a chance to hear about them. But for a little bit more detail, take a look at that webinar box or the Q&A box. Great. And Monica, if you want to hop on as well whenever you have a chance. Great. And if we get her spotlighted, Eric, when you can. Sweet. Okay. So one of the questions that I want to bring forward first was actually one that you addressed, Trinity. It was asking about partnering with the Forest Service on a trail development project for tourism and rural economic stimulation, and just asking what agreements might be appropriate for that. I wanted to kind of broaden the question and see if one or two of you could chime in about, just in general, if a partner comes to the Forest Service with an idea like that, what are some key questions and considerations that you all might start to kind of ask, bring forward to start to help kind of guide down a pathway of finding the right tool? Could someone speak to that?
Yeah, I can take a stab since I answered that. And I think I even said, depending on the goal of the project. So that original question was, you mentioned it, Emery, but I'll just read it. We're interested in partnering with Forest Service on a trail development for tourism and rural economic stimulation project. Might you suggest any particular agreements to pay special attention to? So clearly, what was really emphasized during the presentation were the challenge cost share instrument, which is not an authority, but is followed up by the Interior and Related Appropriations Act. So that's one authority that could be considered and would want to be looked into. The other, and this is where depending on that project goal, could be utilized for job training, manpower development, if your entity is in fact a job training entity who seeks to provide training opportunities for youth, or not even youth, any individuals seeking training for future employment, essentially. So the one caveat to that is, per the statute for the Cooperative Funds and Deposits Act, which we implement through participating agreements, prohibits trail maintenance. So it has to fall under job training, manpower development in order to use that instrument. So the challenge cost share instrument for Interior and Related Appropriations is probably the more appropriate one, unless you are in fact a job training, manpower development institution.
Awesome. Anyone else have anything to add on that? If not, we can move right along. Okay. We also got a few questions, let's see, about the independent sector rate and just what counts as a volunteer for in-kind match. Could someone speak to those two questions again? What is the independent sector rate? If folks could kind of explain what that is and how people might use it, and what is considered a volunteer for in-kind, for the purposes of in-kind match.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that one. The independent sector rate, I had it until I started talking, but I provided the link to that response, and if it needs to be dropped in the chat, I can do that. But it is a national, it's a website where you can go, and it's used nationally so that there's not disparities between volunteer time. So based on what they're doing, what the volunteer is. So a volunteer would be someone who is unpaid for the labor services that they provide towards a project accomplishments. There are, what I did not put in the response, there are certain youth crews like Public Land Corps where they receive a stipend and not a full wage rate. And with that, the difference between their stipend and that wage rate is considered volunteer time. So that can count towards in-kind match as well. So a lot of our youth conservation corps that we work with, that is where some of their in-kind contributions come from.
Awesome. We had a couple of questions about the CGEST tool, just wanting to know how that should be kind of interpreted and utilized. There's a lot of different grayed out census tracts. And if that is the only tool, or if other tools like state tools, for example, for identifying underserved communities could also be used to be applying for that match reduction waiver. Or match waiver.
Okay, so I'm back with this. So the CGEST tool was developed by the Council on Environmental Quality. I'm reading the website so I don't get it wrong. And it was directed by the Biden administration. So it is a government-wide, it's used government-wide by all agencies, again, so that there is equity across how underserved or disadvantaged communities are assessed. And not one agency is applying, different metrics or criteria to these communities. So this is what you will find across the government when determining whether a community is underserved or disadvantaged, whatever the term is being used. I was once told by a representative in our DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, I'm missing the A, I'm so sorry. Accessibility. Thank you. I knew it would come. Group that we tried to use disadvantaged communities more so than underserved, because underserved has historically provided a race-based thought behind it. And when looking at these communities, it cannot be strictly race-based. We have to take into account social economics and other factors, climate economics, or that play into that, not just race-based. So that's where this CGES tool comes in, because it has evaluated all of those criteria. To the grayed out, sorry, Emery, I was remembering the last part, the grayed out communities. I have not been active in the CGES tool for a few months, so I'm not familiar with that. I know that there's a contact button that you can ask questions on or reach out to somebody. Unfortunately, I just don't have that experience working in the website as much to answer that, so I do apologize for that.
No worries. I think the question was just the tool grays out what I think are designated as disadvantaged communities.
Okay.
So I think that's the right way to read it, to whoever asked that question.
Okay.
I think we've gotten through the questions about CGES, disadvantaged communities. We've covered in-kind and kind of match requirements. One, a little bit kind of logistics or grants admin type question that we received was around this idea that there are a few different types of like funding exchanges that happen in agreements, asking about things like cash to cooperator and in kind. And then we also have just different funding streams. And there's some amount of flexibility to modify or to kind of for each of those funding streams to vary. And so wondering just if you all could speak to what the financial picture looks like, kind of pull back the curtains. What are the different funding streams that are being plugged into these agreements? And there's just the amount of flexibility that there is if things shift around a little bit.
Do you want me to go again, or Trinity, do you want to start? Or I don't want. So I'll start, and then others can add as they go. So with the financial plans, those who've worked with them, we have a short form, medium form, long form, depending on what the project and the contributions coming in are. Most of my experiences with the short form, there's the 4 tabs, the Forest Service non-cash contributions, which is Forest Service staff time and supplies and travel put towards the project. We know that Forest Service employees will be there. They should be out assisting and providing information on the project work. Then we have the Forest Service cash to cooperator, which is the amount being obligated to reimburse the cooperator for the work to be performed. And then the cooperator non-cash contributions, which is how I've explained direct expenses to the cooperator for which they will not be reimbursed. So if they have staff or employees that they will be that the Forest Service will not reimburse them for their salary to be paid, they're paying it directly from their bank account. That would be a non-cash contribution, and down with the supplies and contracts. The in-kind contributions are those that are donated. Most of the time we see it in the volunteer realm, the labor. Sometimes we have supplies. If they receive a grant from a non-federal organization sometimes we see folks who get a state grant to perform work, that could be a cash contribution to be used to perform the activities of the project work. I think I saw this question and there was asking the flexibility between the non-cash contribution and the in-kind contribution. So we understand that everything that comes forward is estimated. We can never get it down to the penny as much as we would like to. You have identified that you will put forth this much match. And I think just the communication between the cooperator and the Forest Service project manager to be like, hey, we didn't get as much volunteer work, so we had some of our staff come in and we're going to reimburse that. Just keeping that open communication, as long as you maintain the match that you committed to, we're not getting into the nitty gritty details that way. You know, if you received some nice local landowner felt generous and gave you, you know, $2,000 to work on this project because they were excited about it, you can add that to your the non-cash or the in-kind contributions. So. And then splitting between the differences, anything under 10%, again, we understand it's estimates. So if you don't spend as much in supplies and brought in another person, if it's under that 10%, you can make those adjustments without coming to us and getting that modified.
I would just add that as far as the modification, the formal modification goes, that's absolutely correct. It doesn't need to be formally documented if it's within that 10%, but the partner or recipient must document and retain that documentation as they are requesting reimbursements for the funds that have been obligated and identified in the financial plan.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. One other question that we received is asking about reporting associated with grants and agreements. I know that's a big question, but could you outline generally what people should expect in terms of like the categories of reporting or requirements, or just give people a sense for reporting wise, what's associated with these tools?
Yeah, I'll start that because I was actually typing that response when Darby was talking. So I just said generally the reporting is outlined in the agreement instrument that is signed by the Forest Service and the partner. Frequency of the reporting is minimally on an annual basis. However, it can be more frequent by the requirement of the agency, the partner, or Office of Management and Budget because of specialized funding requirements passed down from Congress. So the reporting frequency depends. The necessary reporting items, or items to be reported, I should say, is dependent on what those milestones and deliverables are that are agreed upon by the Forest Service and the partner. So I'm just going to throw out a quick example. We've talked a lot about trail work projects. So the recreation manager, who is the contact on the Forest Service agreement, would have specific requirements that need to be met by the partner and any of the partners, agents, employees, volunteers. And in the reporting, you would identify how those requirements were met in order to substantiate payments made to that entity. So the reporting complements the payments that are made based on a scope of work that is agreed upon.
Awesome. I'm going to pull forward a question that Robin, you answered in the chat or in the Q&A, but want to make sure that gets out into the world as well. The question was, what are the requirements for a workforce development program? Are those programs typically conservation corps, or can other non-core programs qualify? But Robin, you had an answer that related to those outreach of interest forms that you were discussing. Do you want to provide that specific example?
Yes, we're very excited because later this fall or early winter, we will be publishing an outreach of interest that is solely focused on that workforce area programs. And that's going to define all the different types of workforce programs that we have underneath our the Washington office, National Partnership Office of Workforce and Development. And they have all these different opportunities that you're able to partner with the Forest Service in that workforce development program. So all those will be defined in that outreach of interest, and that will be published, and we're hoping to get a lot of interest and submissions from that outreach. I know that there are many programs underneath that workforce development program area, and they're very excited and really wanting to be able to find some new partners. I mean, we love the older partners too. Don't want to say anything against them, but they're also really looking for new partners as well, and hoping that we can let folks know that all these different workforce programs are out there and available for folks. And so we look forward to people submitting their interest when that comes out. And again, that will be published on grants.gov. And if you email us at opega@usda.gov, we can put your name on the partner catalog. And so that then once that opportunity is available and published, you'll be notified that it's out there.
Awesome. And just so folks know, we will be capturing these questions that have been answered in the chat, and we'll include that with some of our follow-up emails, so that there's a lot to be tracking right now. So you'll have that to look at later on as well. I'm going to hop up to one of our first questions, and that was asking for work in U.S. territories that the Forest Service is responsible to. Are there any restrictions on work or use between a challenge cost share and a participating agreement? So just as a quick clarification, a challenge cost share and a participating agreement, those are both the same type of instrument. There was a question just wanting that sort of clarification. So those are two different instruments, asking about restrictions on work or use between those two agreement instruments. For example, would there still be, would a participating agreement still be able to be used even if it's not on Forest Service land per se? Does anyone want to speak to that one?
So it looks like Emily wants to answer that question. I was going to start, but
No, sorry about that. I just was marked that it was answering live. Go ahead, Trinity.
okay, all right. I actually read this question multiple times and thought I want that to be asked live because it's quite in depth. So I don't know. First, my question would be, what type of work? Because our authorities are what restrict the type of work. There is no between the cost share and the participating agreement, we utilize different authorities to implement those instruments. So we would first need to know what's the type of work. And my experience with U.S. territories is commonly, and I'm keeping this with the topic, right, for forestry protection, hazardous fuels reduction. We do utilize the cooperative fire protection agreements under the Reciprocal Fire Protection Act, most commonly with U.S. territories, because the Reciprocal Fire Protection Act authorizes that specifically for U.S. territories. So if that's the type of work you're referring to, those instruments are not the tool to use. It's actually what we call our cooperative fire protection agreements. If you're talking about other work and would be willing to provide more information on that question and the specifics, then I think it would be easier to answer. But it's very difficult to answer that question so broadly.
Thanks for taking a crack at it, Trinity.
Do you mind if I add something? Trinity's answer is great. She's like, my first question is, and this is something that you might hear from a grants management specialist, is engage them early and often. When you come with, hey, we've got this project, we've got this idea, this is what we're going to do. That is so helpful, because your grants management specialist can get you started off on the right foot from the beginning. And when you kind of paint a visual picture of that project, just walking them through, and they can walk you through, you know, selecting that right instrument and where you need to go with it. So we have a saying in grants and agreements, it depends. And there's always more than one way to add to get the number 10. So we've got a variety of options, and it just comes down to what is the overall project goal, and then that leads to other questions and more discussion.
Awesome. Well, we have a number of different questions that are a little bit kind of like what's possible questions. So I'm going to go through some of those. One question is asking about what might be an appropriate tool or opportunity around post-fire restoration with for a partnership on post-fire restoration to private sector entities. So could you all speak to maybe some partnership examples that have captured post-fire restoration as a scope of work, and what tools might be utilized for those?
So I'll take a stab at this. Those are typically grant opportunities offered through our state private and tribal forestry program area at the Washington office, and they're carried out by that program area. Most commonly, usually because that's where our post-fire recovery work is coordinated. I was trying to find that question because I want to make sure I answer it properly. But if I leave something unaddressed, Emery, let me know. So we have been working just even as recently as the last 2 weeks with congressional staffs for addressing post-wildfire recovery needs and the authorities that can help with that, proposed bills, and reviewing that. But there are currently some grant opportunities that allow state agencies, state foresters, the opportunity to receive grant funding for post-wildfire recovery. So that's the best opportunity available. And those are the ones that can be found at grants.gov at that website, because they are announced formally through a notice of a NOFO, notice of funding opportunity. So that is the best place to look for those. And so that's to say, federal financial assistance is the authority we have for that type of work. We don't currently have, as an agency, an authority that authorizes post-wildfire recovery that has also specific funding appropriations tied to it. So that's something that is recognized across the board, not just agency-wide, but across states. And I believe it's being addressed. That is not to say that we don't have authorities that allow for restoration. So two different things, right? So if you're talking post-wildfire recovery versus restoration, we do have authorities for restoration, and that's where the focus has been.
Awesome. Yeah, the question was about post-fire reforestation to entities. So I think you've hit on it.
Okay. And I would say, as always, and we'll keep saying this, if you have a need and an interest, reach out to your local Forest Service office and start the conversations there with the program staff and the GNA staff early.
Yeah, and if folks maybe need help navigating to who the right contact might be at their Forest Service, kind of local office, or who the right program manager might be, is that a place where the Outreach and Partnership Engagement Office comes in, Robin and Monica? Okay. Great. So get in touch with that email address that we've put in the chat if you have any questions about who to contact for your specific project. One other question was asking about grants or other funding opportunities to pay for the NEPA process that's required for a new trail project, for example, but maybe just more broadly, um, are there different funding opportunities to do that sort of planning work that's really critical to happen before implementation occurs?
Yes, it is possible to fund NEPA work through agreements. Funding, they ask, is there funding? It depends. Sometimes there are appropriations specific for that need. But yes, it is possible to assist with the NEPA prior to the implementation of a project. The two do need to tie together, however, when you execute the agreement. It needs to be included in the scope of work for the project and specifically related to the project that the NEPA is supporting.
And I'll just add to that, that the final decision on the NEPA does lie with the Forest Service. So that does need to be communicated with the cooperator that the Forest Service does hold that final decision-making on the NEPA.
Great, thanks for that clarification. We have a question about Wyden amendment. And again, that was what we mentioned in relation to agreements like Good Neighbor and Stewardship Authority and participating agreements. The question is, actually, we have two related to Wyden amendment. So I'm gonna toss them both out and maybe we can cover a 2-for-1. One being, does the definition of public land in 40 US Code 43-1702. Anyways, the federal definition of public land mean that the Wyden Amendment cannot be used for Good Neighbor Authority projects on BIA trust land. So I guess using the Wyden Amendment, can Good Neighbor Authority be used for projects on BIA trust land? And that's Bureau of Indian Affairs trust land.
That I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that's an excellent question that I don't know that we've ever been presented with before. So I am going to write that down, and I don't know if that's a internal or external, but I will look into that. And I'm just, because it's specific to BIA trust lands, there's another federal agency that would be involved there. So I think we definitely need to look into that. That's a great question. Thank you for bringing that.
Emery, I think we're going to have to follow up on that.
Yeah, I'm sorry we don't have an answer prepared for that.
Well, and the reason we don't is because BIA has specific requirements even for their 638 agreements for tribes. So it may prevent us from being allowed to work directly with tribes through Good Neighbor without including BIA.
Awesome. And the other Wyden related question that we had was asking about what determines whether a participating agreement or a stewardship agreement might be the proper instrument for an agreement that cites Wyden authority.
You cannot cite Wyden on, did you say
Participating
stewardship or participating?
Stewardship, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, then yes, either one would be appropriate. I was like thinking I was going to answer that some other way, but I thought you said cost share. So you can cite Wyden on either of those for work that is both on and off.
Awesome.
So then I guess so that goes back to like the differences then again, like what Trinity was saying before, you have to look at like the total project scope and exactly all of the details to determine which instrument is most appropriate because they both have different intentions.
Awesome. Thanks for underscoring that, Monica. Bear with me trying to do just making sure we're not missing anything. One question that we had was related to volunteer fire department and a volunteer fire department that borders Forest Service land and assists the Forest Service on various fire calls. Trinity, I think this is probably your arena. What avenues would be best suited for a volunteer fire department that again borders Forest Service managed lands and assists the Forest Service on various fire calls?
Okay. Well, I was just typing the answer to that too, so I just sent it, but it's not very thorough, so I'll add on to it. That's a really, I'm so glad somebody asked that. So volunteer fire departments who are interested in non-suppression work, and based on that question, it appears as though they already assist on suppression work under potentially and likely mutual aid, citing reciprocal fire protection, where a fire organization who has firefighting facilities and firefighting responsibility in the vicinity, we don't define vicinity, of National Forest System is authorized to also utilize that authority to assist in similar and I'll say complementary project activities that are non-suppression. So I don't know if that's what that question was actually asking. It just said, what are the avenues for a VFD, who also assists in fire calls? It doesn't really specify just which avenues would be best suited for a volunteer fire department that borders USFS lands and assists the USFS on various fire calls. So I'm making a bit of an assumption that you're looking to do work other than non-suppression. If you're responding under mutual aid, you likely already have a cooperative fire protection agreement with a forest or a region, likely a forest or a district forest in a district area. So that is the avenue that you would continue to pursue. If you're coordinated through the state as a state resource, there are statewide agreements for every state currently, excluding Hawaii. So because there are no national forests in Hawaii. So hopefully that answers, and then the written response ties into that as well.
Great. We have a question about tribal consultation and kind of how that process interrelates to grants and agreements processes. So the question is, when applying for a grant, who is required to work with tribes for consultation? Does that have to come from government to government, or is it initiated by the nonprofit applying for the grant? So could you all speak, I guess, generally about how or if these processes of tribal consultation intersect with any of the grants and agreements processes that we've been talking about?
I wish there was more information here. It just says when applying for a grant. So I'm thinking like in that very initial submitting the proposal for the project. And my understanding is the party who will be performing the work should be doing that tribal consult. I would need more information, I think, on this, if it's the consult has to be done prior to the application being done, or if it comes in after. But if the cooperator or recipient is going to be performing that work, we are looking to ensure that they are consulting with the tribe prior to implementing any of the work, to ensure that they're brought into the decision-making space. So I know that's not a great answer. And I'm open, for emails if we want to discuss that further, and I can bring in the state private tribal forest staff to help answer that more clearly if there's more information that goes with that.
Well, we are coming up on the top of the hour, so we're gonna have to leave it there. We still have a lot of questions, and maybe we can chat about whether you all would be willing to answer some of these, and we can send out those answers along with all of our other materials. I'll just note that one question asked about the getting assistance with the SF 425 form. Just want to note that's what community navigators are here for. That's what outreach and partnership engagement offices are here for. So get in touch with us. We can definitely help you with those forms. And with that, I'm going to finish us off with a quick share screen on some of the resources. Thank you so much, Trinity, Monica, Robin. and Darby for joining on for this Q&A session. Super helpful. Oops, and I lost my screen here. So just as to quickly finish us off, wanted to reshare some of the resources that we found really helpful in navigating this world of grants and agreements. We've shared some of them, but the RVCC Ideas to Action Guidebook is a great resource. NFF has a few webinars. The National Forest Foundation has a few webinars related to just diving into case study examples of these grants and agreements. And we have a resource about sam.gov and grants.gov. Those are pretty critical portals for accessing grant and agreement opportunities. So those will be shared in the chat box if you want to learn more. And to finish us off, just want to leave you all with, again, ways to get in touch with us through the Community Navigator Initiative, through the Outreach and Partnership Engagement branch, and for Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. This is a great place for folks working on any aspect of community wildfire resilience and adaptation. We have an awesome member network, a weekly blog that just touches on every different aspect of this work. So check that out as well if that's of interest and within your scope of work. With that, we will wrap things up. And just as a reminder, our last session is happening a week from today. So we hope to see you then. And thanks so much, everyone, for joining.